This video comes to you from the city of Sochi, and today I've learned that Mr. Kofi Annan, the former UN Secretary General, has passed away. And to my own view, he was a great diplomat, and he has done a lot of efforts to be able to bring peace to different parts of the world. He has had a great legacy, and he has died at the age of 80 years old. He was That's why it's a leader, and what made everybody proud, especially I think Africa at that time. And right now, let me have a look and to go details about his activities. And let's go and remind as the seventh Secretary of General of the United Nations between 1997 and 2006. And he has died at the age of 80 years old. He went through a short illness, and the foundation announced just today. He was again a diplomat, as I have mentioned earlier, the seventh Secretary General, and served for 2 terms between the 1997, the Guardian newspaper article tells, and he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize winner for his humanitarian work jointly with the UN as an organization in 2001. He died in hospital in Bern in Switzerland in the early hours of Saturday, which is with his wife Nani and 3 children, Amo, Kojo, and Nina by his side. He had retired to Geneva and later lived in a Swiss village. Annan's foundation Saturday that describes states nationalist, and who fought throughout his life for a fairer and more peaceful and well, the statement added that Annan, who succeeded Bortos Gali as UN leader, was a son of Ghana and felt a special responsibility towards Africa to lead its refugee agency. Said, in many ways, Kofi Annan was the United Nations. He rose throughout the ranks to lead the organization into the new millennium with matchless dignity and determination. The former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair said on Twitter, said only weeks ago, Kofi Annan was a great deputy statesman and a wonderful colleague who was widely respected and will be greatly missed. My deepest sympathy go to Nani and his family. Theresa May, the UK Prime Minister, said on Twitter. And Theresa May said, sad to hear of the death of Kofi Annan, a great leader and reformer of the UN. He made a huge contribution to making the world. He has left a better place and working for peace and humanity and human rights, founded by Nelson Mandela and Gro Harlem Brundtland of Norway, and the Bob's deputy chair, and she and her colleagues were devastated by Annan's death. And Kofi Annan was a strong and inspiring presence to us all, and the elders would not be where it's today without his leadership. Throughout his life, Kofi worked unceasingly to improve the lives of millions of people around the world. Born in Kumasi, Ghana on April the 8th in 1938, Annan joined the UN system in 1962 as an administrative officer with the World Health Organization in Geneva. Annan later served with the Economic Commission for Africa in Addis Ababa, the UN Emergency Force in Ismailia, When the Secretary General, before becoming Secretary General, he was under Secretary General for peacekeeping, and also served as special representative of the Secretary General to the former Yugoslavia between 1995 and 1996. As head of UN peacekeeping operation, Annan was criticized for the body's failure to halt the genocide in Rwanda in 1990s. The UN can be improved. It's not perfect, but it didn't exist. You would have to create it. It didn't exist. You would have to create it. He told the BBC during the interview for the 80th birthday in April. I'm a stubborn optimist, and I was born an optimist and will remain an optimist, told Kofi Annan during his BBC interview. As far as I remember, that was a Hot Talk program. Annan used his final speech as Secretary General in December 2006 to deliver a promising shot to the administration of George W. Bush, accusing the U.S. of committing human rights abuses in the name of fighting terror. The Guardian concluded that the time that the speech amounted to a broad condemnation of the neoconservative ideology guiding U.S. foreign policy under Bush, and was a clear break with protocol for a departing UN chief. It was another sign of Annan's anger at the administration since the U.S. invaded Iraq in March 2003 without the approval of the UN Secretary General, and this means that he was too much angered by the U.S. Without abiding the UN vetoes and without any consideration, and bypassing the United Nations obligations of non-invasion of any country without the approval of the UN Security Council. The Bush administration just invaded Iraq. When power, special and military forces used, this is quote, the world will consider it legitimate only when convinced that it's being used for the right purpose, for broadly shared aims in accordance with broadly accepted norms. End of quote. His speech delivered at the Harry Truman Presidential Library in Independence in Missouri. There are a lot of articles about this man. And let's go into some other perhaps I'll pick up some other details about Kofi Annan, and right away, sometimes it's said that sometimes you don't have to be. When you have been a Secretary General of the United Nations for 10 years, it's never going to be easy, said Kofi Annan. To slip into humdrum anonymity, Kofi Annan gave it a good go. On leaving office, he and his wife borrowed a friend's Italian hideaway deep in the forest near Lake Como and retreated into 8 weeks of blissful solitude. With no TV, no radio, no papers, Annan was free finally from the clamor of the world's troubles. 2 weeks in, he began to get bored. Let's go to the tobacconist in the village. He suggested and buy a paper. They had been in the shop for less than 5 minutes before his heart sank. A group of men were gathered in the corner studying. Oh no, he whispered to his wife, I've got 6 weeks to go and we've blown our cover. How are we going to manage? One of the men approached and thrust out the pen, flashed his best Hollywood smile, scribbled Morgan Freeman, and fled. So when people say here is a man who needs no introduction, he chuckles. I say to them carefully. As he's telling the story, it occurs to me that the tourist's failure to recognize his successor would not constitute an amusing anecdote. Annan does have Oh my goodness. Annan does have a curiosity movie star presence, flawlessly crisp and unusually still, but 5 years after leaving office, he remains more commanding presence in the world affairs than Ban Ki-moon. I thought retirement was going to be easier. He smiles, quote, but I discover it's hard work. I should do what Mandela says and retire from retirement one day. We must just a few. Yeah, something was going wrong with our camera. I don't know what was the exact reason. We must just a few weeks after we meet after a few weeks after this after he stood down at the UN Special Envoy to Syria and his dismay at the ongoing carnage clearly hasn't faded. It's equally clear, however, that he saw no choice but to quit. The first thing I said to the Security Council was, "This is a new impossible. This is a new impossible task. I'm going to try, but I can only do it if I have your united and sustained support." Because you need that support in order to put pressure on all those parties. United is key. Be united. But the Security Council remained divided, and its consequences, and its consequence, Annan says, gravely, the Syrians are going to pay the price. It's an innocent people. It's an innocent people caught in the middle. The plight of Syria, the plight of Syria, the illustration of the fundamental message. Interventions, life in war and peace tells the story of the 50-year-old UN career, and the emerging role of the UN peacekeeping. It's a role with which Annan has been intimately linked. About humanitarian intervention, like Syria's future today lies ultimately at the whim of the security and until the early 1990s, UN peacekeeping efforts had been minimal. Most conflicts been adjudicated by the world's two superpowers, whose hostility ensured a Security Council to authorize more than a handful of peacekeeping missions. Between 1987 and 1982, barely a single UN mission consisted of more than 100 observers facing little personal risk. By 1994, however, 80,000 UN troops were deployed in highly dangerous war zones, and then took charge of peacekeeping in 1993. And his book provides a fascinating account of the new challenges facing the Security Council that, no longer paralyzed by division, finds itself the repository of global demands for something to be done about pretty much every problem in the world. Time and again, I quote, when member states and the governments are forced with an insoluble problem, and they are under pressure to do something, but that something usually ends up being referred to the UN, end of quote. He allows a right chuckle. The Security Council, quote, is dealing with it so they can relax, and mandates, yes, but you just don't have resources to deal with it, so you are bound to run, fail, and then be blamed. Just say the letters SG, the Secretary General, stood for scapegoat, end of quote. Yeah, we can imagine that while he was his tenure as the UN Secretary General, he had to deal with, had to go through a lot of hardships and difficulties, because a failure is so much visible to everybody, but any success is less visible, and that's why he was in a very tough and difficult and conundrum in that kind of a position. The new appetite for humanitarian intervention was in its honeymoon period in 1993, when UN forces were committed in Somalia to what the then U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright declared in quote an unprecedented enterprise aimed at nothing less than the restoring of an entire country, end of quote. But after rebels downed the U.S. helicopters, the Americans pulled out and the UN mission collapsed. The legacy of this failure, Annan writes, explains why the UN stood by and watched a massacre unfold in Rwanda a year later. When the world belatedly woke up to the genocide, UN peacekeepers were blamed for member states' reluctance to risk their own troops' lives. When it came to Kosovo in 1999, Russian support for Serbia ruled out any chance of Security Council resolution mandating troops. For the first time in the history of the UN, a Security Council endorsed military action, conducting the Secretary General endorsed military action. Authoritarian state. It was an Annan's account. The ultimate moral dilemma. Do loyalties lie with the UN and the rule of law, with the innocent civilians being slaughtered? He stands by his support for the NATO airstrikes, but warned at the time that unless the Security Council was restored as the sole source of legitimacy, the world would be, end of quote, on a dangerous path to anarchy, end of quote. That's the prediction proved horribly prescient 4 years later, when the Security Council failed to pass a second resolution authorizing an invasion of Iraq, and the war went ahead anyway. The war came close to costing him his job, but to many of his admirers, it became his finest moment. Annan was always doubtful about the extent of Saddam's hidden WMDs, or weapons of mass destruction. Quote, the UN inspectors had been in there for quite a long time and destroyed quite a few arms. In fact, people argued that they destroyed more weapons than the first Gulf War. So, the feeling was that he may have had something, but how massive and the nature of the weapons was unsure. So why wouldn't Saddam so cooperate with their inspectors? Unquote, he had been bluffing to his neighbors for so many years, telling them, I'm powerful, I've got these weapons, don't mess with me. And it was psychological bluff, so he couldn't bear to admit that actually he lied. I think that was the explanation, end of quote. Annan's great regret was to appoint a gun-who weapons inspector incentive to the delicacy of Iraqi military pride. Richard Butler, he writes, was a quote, a colossal mistake and one of the most appointments I ever made, end of quote. Why? In a place like Baghdad, where the people are very nationalistic, you need to find a way to work with them. You cannot go there and throw your way around. He still winces at the at the memory of all the grandstanding that led inexorably to war. And bizarrely, in the midst of the George W. and George Bush fighting talk, the president told Annan, quote, it brings tears to my eyes to think of what the Iraq people are going through under Saddam, end of quote. Annan is generous enough to say, quote, I think it was genuine. I don't think it would be crocodile tears, end of quote, but pretty blunt about Bush's other motives. There was quite a bit of that in the air that he was trying to finish his death job, and the advisors around him also wanted that. They were also thinking, we kill two birds with one stone, and we get rid of the bad dictator and get rid of the weapons. What about the third part? Iraq's oil reserves. Well, that's what people say. Anas agrees with Chakal. Those who say it have often been dismissed as lefty conspiracy and theorist. But when I ask if Annan would say it himself, he replies without hesitation, yes. It was a country with resources and region of extreme importance to the world. I'm not sure if Iraq had been as poor as Somalia, that there would have been that interest in going to save the country. He's less sure about Tony Blair's motivation. Tony, at his best, in his heyday, would have been one of the most brilliant politicians of his time. But how he got himself entangled with this? I think there was a genuine friendship with Bush, but perhaps there was a greater need where on Tony's side than on Bush. I wasn't sure if Tony genuinely wanted to go to war or was just trying to protect the special relationship, and the special relationship trumped everything. It's difficult to say because at the beginning he appeared to be on the side, and he was also in favor of a second resolution. I hope that would have been the point where you tell George, you are on your own. I'm not following you on this without the council resolution. And I wonder what George would have said. Does he think it might have stopped him? I think it could have made a big difference, says Kofi Annan in his book, where some passages out of which I'm quoting. In 2007, Blair was appointed special envoy to Quartered, a diplomatic mission created in 2002 by Annan himself to represent the UN, the US, the EU, and the UK and Russia in peace talks on Palestine. I found Blair's appointment baffling and tell Annan I struggled to see how he could do it. Annan completes the sentence, yeah. So he shares their bewilderment. I share some of that. I was surprised that he accepted the role, and nothing much is appearing on that dossier. For the past 4 to 5 years, there has been no real Middle East meditation. Annan famously declared that Iraq was illegal and has never regretted it. Quote, because that was my genuine belief, end of quote. But the price he paid took even him by surprise. The UN got attacked, and I got attacked personally. The oil for food situation was used to beat me up and also beat up the UN. The US made allegations of the widespread corruption under the oil for food program, which Annan believes were motivated entirely by a desire to punish him. For they took a sinister turn when his own son, Kojo, became implicated. Kojo had worked for a Swiss company, which in 1998 won a contract under the program. He left the company that same year, but then came the revelation that, unbeknown to his father, it had continued to pay himself for a further 5 years. Annan was mortified and furious. Oh, this kind of the very hot kind of an infighting, kind of an a conspiracy is always underway in those behind the scenes circles, the UN or the United States, and there is no any kind of a clear-cut policy. And that is what Mr. Annan is describing in his book, and what I'm delivering to you on this YouTube channel. It must have tested this father and son relationship to breaking point. Yes, he agreed unnecessarily. A friend of mine said, "It's tough for you, but I also feel for your son. You come under the microscope, not because of something you have done or who you are, but because of your father, and that makes life difficult for a young person." But I said, there are certain things you just do it. Why hadn't Kojo told his father about the ongoing payments? Maybe sometimes if you think you need help from daddy, you probably don't share all the information. I don't know. We're talking about a boy who was 22 and 23 at that time, but now we are okay. The pressure from Washington was ferocious, says in his book Mr. Kofi Annan, the UN Secretary General, who passed away today on August the 18th, 2018. Today is Saturday. The pressure from Washington was ferocious, but he never seriously contemplated resignation. It may have fleetingly crossed my mind. Sometimes you feel, who needs this? Why should one put up with this? But I felt it was witching. So to walk away and give them the feeling that they have won? No, says Kofi Annan. For all its ugliness, the onslaught against Annan was in the essence to more than a manifestation of the fundamental tension underscoring his whole diplomatic career, the conflict between national self-interest or realpolitik and that lofty ideal of international law embodied by the organization Annan served for 50 years. Quote, they clash, he agrees with a smile. I think we've made progress, but you are right. The national interest still often trumps the broader interest. But what governments and people don't realize is that sometimes the collective interest, the international interest, is also the national interests. Kofi Annan, once again, let's run through his biography. Was born in 1938 into a powerful Ghanaian tribe. Annan had a privileged childhood in what was a Gold Coast, and coming of age at his country and won independence from Britain, awarded a scholarship to study in America, assumed he had returned to serve his nation, but a job with the World Health Organization to Geneva introduced him to a worldly and engaging environment, which made him reassess his loyalties. I began, he writes, to realize that a community for the world, for me, would mean something different from what it had meant to my father's generation. How does someone with so little personal sense of national loyalty get through to get men from whom it's everything? I've always wondered what Annan says to world leaders, often tyrants, even crypto-terrorists, to win their trust them to make peace. The book is to marathon late-night phone calls to warring parties, and the author, he says, is quite understand what drives them, appeal to their pride and vanity, and offer them a way out that saves face. Dignity is very important. It's about dignity. Without beating up on them, I say, if you are really a leader and are interested in the interests of your people, you have to lead. You have to show courage. If you are really a strong man, as you say you are, you have to look out for the weak in your society. Look at what you are doing to them, says Mr. Annan in his book. They have to feel that you have their interests at heart. These are people with egos and the sense of legacy. So you ask, what a legacy are you going to leave? Saddam probably saw himself as a modern day Saladin, the glorious Arab warrior. He saw himself as someone who was building his nation. So you tell him, you want all this destroyed? How do you think you will be judged? That matters, because these people often have a certain image of themselves, and they will go to an incredible extent to protect themselves. So I tell them what their actions meant. What their actions meant, we exactly don't know. I've got to change position. That's why I'm guessing that you were not able to just observe it, to have a look, to have a clear-cut vision of my face, and I look like this, just to have a close observation. How do I look like? I've got some biceps like that. Sometimes I do a workout, but let's go on with Mr. Annan's book and what he says about uh, his activities down there. Dignity is very important. It's a very dignity is very important, he says, and it's my goodness. I've got to adjust the camera to a certain degree of so that it pictures me well. Okay, well, and dignity is very important. It says it's about dignity without beating up you, them. And I say, if you are really a leader, you are interested in the interests of your people. That matters because these people often have a certain image, have a certain image of themselves, and they will try to go incredible extent to protect themselves. So I tell them that their actions meant how they are seen by the outside world. I suspect Annan must struggle to imagine must struggle how divisible when I ask him to name the single greatest misconceptions about him. His first response is tell about me or about the UN. About him, I say he falls into a lengthy, silent thought, and that's too soft. He offers eventual because they feel he doesn't pound that table. They're not assertive enough, but it doesn't bother me because sometimes as you don't have to fight to get your way, you don't have to pick up a fight to get them to change their mind or get them to see things your way. You really don't. And that was the extract from Mr. Annan's book. Thanks for watching Samuel's channel, and this video comes to you from the southern part of Russia, from the city of Sochi, and the Black Sea is just a half a mile from here away. Thanks for watching. We'll see you soon. Until then.